Okay, hello everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us. This is the Crusades, part one, the first part of a multi-part live stream history series that our friend Richard Sassoon is going to be hosting for us. So Richard, it's all yours. Take it away, and thanks for being here.
Um, yeah, it's really nice to meet everybody. Somebody asked in the questions just quickly if I'm related to Siegfried Sassoon. He is my fifth cousin. Vidal Sassoon, we have no relation.
Good questions.
So this is going to be a presentation on the Crusades. It is one in a series of four such presentations. And yeah, so I also see that there are several participants with their hands raised.
It's going to be tough to, if you can't really raise your hand in this program. We have too many people that are joining us, so there's a few hundred people. So if you have a question or a comment, just use the chat or the Q&A, and Richard, Zach, and I will keep an eye on it. We can't call on individual people. We have too big of a group. Okay, Richard, it's all yours. Take it away.
Yeah, this is part one, a prelude to the Crusades and the First Crusade. So I want to sort of give the rules sort of my presentation style. The first thing is that this is not an academic presentation. I'm a lawyer by trade, so I'm not skilled in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. I'm a layperson that has taken an interest in them. That said, this is going to be a secular presentation. So even though obviously there will be religious elements to be discussed here, I'm going to approach it from a secular and historical perspective. The next thing is that I would encourage everybody, especially because of the religious sensitivities, to be respectful. But at the same time, I do treasure questions, comments, clarifications. So please put those in the chat and I'll try to address them as we go forward. There are a couple questions about the number of sessions. Robert is putting in the sessions about 3 weeks ahead. So since the fourth session is in 3 weeks from now, it probably will go up in about a week or so in order to see that, but there are 4 sessions. Now, another point is that my first slide does have a picture of Muhammad. It is a Shiite icon, so it's not in any way disrespectful to him as a person, but there are some people who have views about Muhammad and whether he should be depicted or not. And so if that's the case, I would encourage you to not look while I'm on that slide, and I'll tell you when I'm on the next slide. This class will be what I call a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you know something already, I'll take you to the next level. And this class will have a 90-minute hard stop. Now, of course, since I started 15 minutes late, obviously I'm going to give that 15 minutes as well. But after 90 minutes, I'm not going to put up any new slides, which means that if you have to leave at the end of the 90 minutes, you won't miss any new material, right? Yeah, I'll pick up where we stopped in the next of the 4 sessions. Right. And this is going to be recorded just like the other 3 sessions. And so that is something that you can watch at a later time if you can't make one of the sessions or you want to go back and see some of the things that we talked about. One of the things that I wanted to clarify is the Islam 101 series is done by Sabil Ahmed, who's a wonderful religious scholar, but he approaches Islam from a religious perspective. And so there is going to be some kind of disagreement to a certain degree about Islamic history, Islamic belief, and so forth between me and him because of the way we're approaching the material. In terms of my background, because I have a question about that, my family is Middle Eastern. We have a Jewish background. Arabic was my native language growing up along with English. And so I see the Crusades more from a Middle Eastern perspective than from a Western perspective, which might be interesting to those of you listening. And please, if you have a comment, please put it in the chat as opposed to the question section. Yeah, and so the picture of Muhammad is now on the screen. And if you raise your hand, nothing will come of it. So please, if you put your comments in the chat, then I can read them as we go through, and so can Robert and Zach. So, okay. So just to give sort of a background on what Islamic civilization was prior to the Crusades, you had a situation where a number of different Arabian tribes were confederating, and Muhammad in his life was, obviously this is a very abridged version of his life, but he lived in the city of Medina. And in Medina, there were 5 major tribes and 1 minor tribe. And into this, the Muslim community or the Muslim Ummah stepped in and wrote what was called the Constitution of Medina, unifying these tribes under under the rule of Muhammad and his Muslim Ummah. This was a defense pact, a mutual trade pact, and eventually Muhammad was able to galvanize a military force and launch a war on the city of Mecca. Now, there's a question about whether he instigated that war, whether the Meccans instigated that war. Regardless of how the original nature of the war began, Muhammad was able to prevail over the Meccans and conquer the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula based from the city of Medina. Now, once he had conquered this area, he was now in a very interesting geopolitical situation. So Muhammad died in 633. And after he died, he was succeeded by what was called the rightly guided Caliphate. And the rightly guided Caliphate, as I said, was in a very interesting geopolitical position. As you can see on the map on the left-hand side, you had the Byzantine Empire, which is in red, and on the east, you had the Sasanian Persian Empire, which is in blue. Both of these empires were incredibly powerful empires that had gone to war with each other on numerous occasions, most recently from about 602 to 628. And the war between those 2 powers was absolutely devastating. You can think of it as the Middle Ages equivalent of World War II, right? Massive number of military thrown, large amounts of territory occupied and then reconquered, entire cities burnt to the ground, and the military power that both of these empires had was greatly spent. And you can compare, if you look on the right-hand side, that just as Muhammad was winning his victories and consolidating power in the western area of Saudi Arabia today, we have somebody saying that they can only see my introductory slide. Can other people note whether or not you can see my slides changing?
Yes, Richard, I can see all your slides. So if anyone's having any problems, you should probably try refreshing or restarting your session.
Good. Okay.
But all good.
Wow, everybody's chiming in. That's fantastic. I love the engagement. So, so we have this massive war going on, and these 2 empires are completely spent, which gives the successors to Muhammad the ability to conquer all of the Sasanian Persian Empire and 2/3 of the Byzantine Empire. Now, I also had a question here as to how do they know where to expand, that there weren't maps. That is false. There were lots of complex maps that existed in this time period. People were well aware of the major empires at this time. There was extensive trade, both between the Byzantine Empire and Sasanian Empire, despite the war, and there was trade between both and Arabia. There was huge networks connecting these regions, and maps of this area of the world were actually relatively accurate. In fact, if you saw one from this time period, you would easily recognize where the borders are. Now, of course, the southern part of Africa, the eastern part of Asia, these areas were not well articulated, or the northern part of Europe, the same. But the area around the Mediterranean was actually relatively good. Yeah, so I have a question of what's happening in Muscat. Muscat at this point was under the rulers of Magan and their successors, which was an independent principality. For those of you who are familiar with Muhammad's letters of conquest, Muhammad sent a letter to Heraclius, who was emperor of the Roman Empire, saying that he should submit to Muhammad's religion. He sent him another one to Khosrow II, who was the Shah of the Sassanid Persians, saying that they should also submit. And if they wouldn't submit, then God would, of course, give victory to the Muslims over them and allow them to annex their empires. A similar letter was sent to the princes of Muscat with exactly this same idea, that they should convert to Islam or Muhammad would send an army to conquer them. Now, of course, Heraclius, Emperor Heraclius of the Byzantines and Shah Khosrow II of the Persians basically threw the letter in the trash. From their perspective, it would be like as if the ruler of Afghanistan approached the president of the United States and said, you should surrender to the great forces of Afghanistan. But the Omanis did not have that reaction, right? Because the Omanis were a roughly equivalent power to what Muhammad had arrayed in the western part of Saudi Arabia. And so the Omanis accepted. And the Omanis today are actually very proud of having accepted this letter. And so if you go to Muscat, you will actually see a framed replica of the letter that they believe that Muhammad authored to them, promoting their inclusion into the Islamic world. Okay. So once these territories had been conquered, and when we say that they were conquered, we're not talking about something like the Spanish conquest of the Americas, where the entire ruling authority was dethroned, an entirely new governing authority was implemented, and the local population was ostracized. It's much more similar to some, I'm trying to think of a good equivalent, some of the puppet states and vassal states the United States created, for example, when we created the Southern Republic of Vietnam, right, in the before the Vietnam War, where you have a government that's completely loyal to a foreign power, but at the same time has a certain degree of local governance involved as well. And this is especially true when we talk about Persia. In Persia, the Persian bureaucrats called the Dikhan basically agreed to be part and parcel of the new Umayyad Caliphate, right? Because we had gone from Muhammad's state to the rightly guided Caliphate, which survived for about 40 years or so. And then from that, in 661, we transferred to the Umayyad Caliphate because of internal conflicts and revolts within the empire. But that Umayyad Caliphate continued to work with these Dikhans who administered the area according to Persian law and custom. As long as these Dikhans converted to Islam, their populations didn't have to convert. The Dikhans who did not convert to Islam lost their title. And because the Dikhans had already established a large-scale bureaucracy to run the Persian Empire, the Umayyads just replaced the people at the top and kept the entire administration the same. That said, when the Umayyads conquered Byzantine territories, they also worked with Byzantine aristocrats and bureaucrats, although the Byzantine Empire was less effectively managed than the Persian Empire. Over time, we see more and more Arabs replacing the Persians and Byzantines, especially the Byzantines, who are involved in the primary architecture of the states that they're conquering. But by and large, you have some kind of integration between both of these peoples. And you have a number of regulations that permit minority religions to continue professing their faith in exchange for certain taxes and certain limits on their ability to proselytize or to openly display their religion, such as marches in the street, for example, or bells tolling on churches. So we have this development of the Umayyad Empire, and this is the map of the Umayyad Empire at its height in 750. You can see that they conquered all of Northern Africa all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Most of Spain, with the exception of the mountainous region of Asturias, was under their control as well. And the Middle East, with the exception of what we now call Turkey, except for the areas in Turkey that are colloquially understood today to be Kurdistan, right? And this was a massive empire. It was the 10th largest land empire in history. The 10th largest empire in history, one of the largest land empires in history. And we have this consolidated authority that would then be challenged by the Abbasids, which were a rival clan. Now, the Abbasids brought the empire to its greatest cultural heights, even though the Umayyads had brought it to its largest physical extent. After the Umayyads were dethroned, the empire began to contract in terms of size and power. Even though the Abbasids managed to remain in power for, even though it managed to remain in power for 5 centuries, the majority of that period is as an ecclesiastical power. Think of how the Vatican exists in Rome today, right? It doesn't have any territorial power beyond that city. And in the case of the Abbasid Caliphate, the city was Baghdad. But it has incredible weight in terms of its ability to speak on behalf of the Catholic people. And the Abbasid Caliph spoke on behalf of the Muslim community, with the exception, of course, of the Shiites, who at this point in time are a relative minority. But the Abbasid caliphs, as I pointed out, began to lose terrestrial power. And that terrestrial power began to be usurped by their palace guards. One of the things that dominates in the Abbasid Caliphate is that you have an importation, a large-scale importation of slaves. And slaves come from 3 different regions. They come from Africa, they come from Central Asia, and they come from Europe, right? The white slaves from Europe are called Sakaliba, the Turkish slaves from Central Asia are called Mamluk, and the black slaves from Africa are called Zanj. These slaves become part and parcel of the Abbasid Caliphate in terms of its internal organization and development, especially since the Sakaliba and Sakaliba were given jobs in the administration. They were slaves in the sense that they were owned people, but they were not necessarily working on a large-scale plantation, right? They were working a bureaucratic desk job, but they were not in charge of their own position there. They could not choose who to freely marry. They could not change the place in which they lived. And if they wanted to be free, they needed to buy their freedom. So they were slaves. But what's really important for us in terms of this lesson, and the Zanj, of course, coming from Africa, we already see within the Islamic world, starting in the 8th century, indications that the black skin was seen as a marker of inferiority. Long before this becomes transposed onto a more European context that we're familiar with. And blacks within the Islamic world, generally speaking, if they were slaves, were put onto large plantations. There were large cotton plantations, especially in what's now Iraq and Egypt. And so that was the allocation of these slaves. But what's really important for our discussion today are the Turkish slaves, the Mamluk. And these slaves were primarily brought in from a military perspective. These were slave armies. And it sounds counterintuitive to say that because one could easily imagine that if you are an enslaved person and you are given a weapon, the first thing that you would do is turn around on your captor. But the major thing is you have to realize that everybody around you is also a slave, and you don't know to what extent they're happy with the same arrangement. And so to create a coalition of those of you who would want to revolt against this structure, where you are fed, where you are housed, where you are organized, you're in a foreign land where you don't speak the language, you have a number of different things that could be at issue. And so we, in the first centuries of Umayyad and Abbasid rule, we don't see many revolts from the Mamluk. This changes in the 800s with the anarchy at Samarra, where these Mamluk begin to use the caliph as more of a legitimation as they begin to rule and choose who will be the caliph. I have a question. Is there anything written about the slaves by people who enslaved? Absolutely. We have a number of documents about this period. Probably the best source on what were called the Zanj revolts, for example, because there were massive revolts throughout Iraq in the late 800s. Is At-Tabari, and modern scholars even say that At-Tabari was too extreme in terms of his argument about how big the revolt was and how prevalent it was. And At-Tabari was thoroughly disgusted by the way the Arabs treated the Zanj. Now, of course, the Zanj revolt is a very complex topic, and it's not just the blacks. There were other religious and social minorities like Marsh Arabs who were involved. But there are a lot of Arab writers from this period writing about slavery. Very few of them are arguing anything close to an abolition mindset, but they are arguing something closer to an acceptability mindset, right? How much labor can you force a person to do? In terms of the Sakaliba and Mamluk, people are writing about them, but not in a negative way. It's seen like this is just a natural part of politics. I have a question. How do these entire ethnicities become slaves in the first place? That's a great question. We have a number of merchants that are going out to these regions, and what you will end up typically having is that local tribes will attack other local tribes and sell the defeated tribesmen to a merchant. So if we're talking about the Sakaliba, for example, because this is the one that's best attested historically, we have the leaders of the Kievan Rus, right? Even though it has the word Rus in it, it's more important to think of it as based in Ukraine today. And the leaders of the Kievan Rus would basically go into the hinterland, kidnap people, bring them to the southern ports on the Black Sea, and ship them further south, either to Constantinople, and then from Constantinople onward to the Arab world, or directly through the Bosphorus to the Arab world. And there was a huge trade in Sakaliba. Sakaliba were very highly desired. There were also corsair pirates who would kidnap people along the coast and sell them. When it comes to the Mamluk, we have Turkish tribes betraying other Turkish tribes and selling them. Because you have to remember this idea of a pan-white consciousness, a pan-Turkic consciousness, a pan-African consciousness does not exist at this time period. You have tribes, and these tribes are negotiating how to acquire more assets for their own survival, and selling slaves can get them access to raw materials that they can't find in the areas where they are. Ukraine, Central Asia, Southern Africa, these are not resource-heavy regions. There's a question of, was the law at this time Muslim-based, the way that Western law was Christian-based? Absolutely. The Abbasid Caliphate was ruling according to the Sharia. Now, there are, Sharia is the Islamic jurisprudential system. Of course, there is a degree to which we can say that the Abbasid caliphs were also motivated by terrestrial concerns. And so if we went line by line of the historical things that they did, with a Sharia scholar, I'm sure that they would point out a number of different things that they did that are violations of the Sharia. But from the perspective of the Abbasids, that is the way that they were governing. And the Sharia, unlike Catholic law, is much more intrusive in terms of the level of specificity over which the laws sit, right? There's no Catholic law on taxation. There's no Catholic law on property sales. There's no Catholic law on, I'm trying to think, on contracts and torts, right? These are, to the extent that these existed, they were primarily administered by the different nation states under the Catholic umbrella. That's not the case under the Sharia. These things do have specific legal treatises that the Sharia does cover. I have a question of what language was used to write about slaves? Arabic. Arabic was the dominant language of the Ottoman Empire. Even former slaves themselves who wrote about themselves or their condition wrote in Arabic. Where the Slavs factor in this scenario, as I mentioned, the Slavs were selling Sakaliba, and Slavs were the majority of the population that were Sakaliba. And that's where the term slave comes from in English, is this use of this word Slav. In America, you could generally not overcome being a slave. Your children were slaves as well. What was it like here? How did children fare? It's actually a very complicated question. And it depends, in many cases, the Africans, the Zanj, were castrated. So we don't have a large number of Zanj children. We do have some. There are Zanj, for example, in Iraq today. They are obviously not slaves, but the number of Zanj children is relatively low. In terms of Sakaliba and Mamluk, because they looked similar enough to the Arab population, when their children were manumitted, they could physically escape the history of slavery. And in fact, there's a huge preference, especially as you move later in time, towards whiter skin, especially in the Ottoman Empire. So that's much further in the future of where we're going to cover. But and so being from that heritage was actually desirable as opposed to undesirable. All right. But what's important to take away here is that with the anarchy at Samarra, we have the first time that the Turks are taking power in their own right, but it's indirect power. They are choosing the caliphs, but the caliphs are still Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula who have now moved to, in this case, Baghdad, but the Turks are not taking power as their own sultans as their own power base. And of course, what ends up happening is that the Abbasid Caliph, as I said, becomes an ecclesiastical entity. This is a map from the year 970. If you refer to most books, they'll say that the Abbasid Caliphate existed from the year 750 until the year 1258. So we should see on this map, which is dead center in the middle of that time period, a gigantic Abbasid Caliphate, and that's not what we see at all. We see no such thing. And in fact, we see a number of different states. The Buyids are highlighted here because the Buyids were Shiite. They were what we're called Zaydi Shiite. And if you look in the westernmost area of the Buyid Emirates, you can see Baghdad, which was somehow isolated and the capital of Sunni Islam in the middle of a Shiite country. The Fatimids were also Shiite, but they were Ismaili Shiite, so it's a different group. And all the other blue states are Sunni. All the purple states are Christian of some variety, be it Armenian Apostolic Church, the Byzantines were Greek Orthodox. And so you had a huge religious diversity going on in terms of the states in the Middle East after the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate as a terrestrial power. Okay. So the next thing that I want to point out is that in Africa, we also see the collapse of Abbasid power. It's not just a Middle Eastern phenomenon. You have a number of different states that carve out that territory by the mid-900s. So now, one of the things that's worth pointing out is who these Fatimids are. So we talk about the conflict between Sunnis and Shiites today. There was also conflict between Sunnis and Shiites back then. I would argue that it's not specifically religiously based, but it's more in terms of power and power structures. Given the weakening power of the Abbasid Caliph during this period, the Fatimids declared their own caliphate, right? Because the declaration of a caliphate means that all of the Islamic world should turn to you. So this was a direct confrontation to the Abbasid caliphs. For those of you who are more familiar with European history, you can think of this as the Babylonian captivity, right, where you have two popes. But of course, the Fatimids were Ismaili, which means that they were Shiite, and they were incredibly evangelistic of their Shiite religion. That said, when they conquered Egypt, the majority of Egyptians were Sunni, and it remained Sunni. You had large-scale conquerors like Jawhar as-Sakili. As I mentioned, he was his term Sakili means that he's from Sicily, and he was Sakaliba, despite the fact that he was the leader of the military of the Fatimids. Right, so you have slaves in these very important positions of power. And it was the Fatimids who really built the city of Cairo as we know it today. You can see, for example, the Al-Qahira al-Muwaizia, or the Jewel of Cairo on the left-hand side. And they also built a number of other structures that really define Cairo today because they had built that city. So with this strong opposition to Sunni Islam in this period, right, we have the power of the Fatimids, and also the Abbasid Caliphate is completely surrounded by the Buyids, who are also Shiite. We have a reaching out by the Abbasid Caliph towards other powers that might be interested in re-empowering Sunni Islam in the region. And at first, they reach out to the Ghaznavids, who are a Turkic people in what's now southeastern Iran and Pakistan and Afghanistan. But what the group that really ends up saving them are who are called the Seljuks. And you start with Seljuk Beg. Beg is a title like prince or lord. So Seljuk Beg was coming from the Seljuk heartland, which is in modern Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. They were a nomadic people, and Seljuk Beg was the first person in his family to convert to Islam. The majority of the people of this region were non-Muslims. They were what we colloquially call today Tengrists, who are people who worship the great sky, similar to the way that the Mongol Khans worship the great sky at roughly the same time. So Seljuk, and you can sort of see from the upper right-hand side, right, these are the nomadic pastoralists under Seljuk Beg, and he manages to consolidate his tribe and launch an invasion of Ghaznavid territory to move into the northeastern part of Iran. He's succeeded by his sons and their sons, who continue to win stunning battles, moving into Persia and taking over that territory. They would eventually make their way further into Anatolia and most of the wider Middle East, as you can see on the maps and the arrows there. Those later conquests being taken by the two brothers, Tughril Bey and Shakhr Bey. You can see them on the lower right-hand side. Now, there is an important point to make here, which is that the Seljuks, when they conquered Persia, noticed these Persian bureaucrats, right? These Persian bureaucrats had survived from the Abbasid Caliphate through the disintegration of that caliphate into different Iranic states that we showed in that 970 CE map. And the Turks realized immediately that while they were effective from a military perspective, they were not effective from a governance perspective. They had no idea how to rule large swaths of millions of sedentary people. Persia's population at this time is probably around the 5 to 7 million mark. If you take all of that territory together, that is now the current country of Iran. So that is something that was orders of magnitude bigger than the Seljuks had ever seen. So they kept that system. And so you can see here, this is Abu Ali Hassan ibn al-Tusi, although he is much more commonly known by the name Nizam al-Mulk, which was a nickname, a laqab, given to him, meaning the organizer of the kingdom, or the system of the kingdom. Because this man was the chief Persian who responded to the request by the Seljuks, especially Shakhr Bey, to organize this system. And he developed the idea, which was called iqta'. And this is an important idea to understand. If you see the map in the center, you can see that there's a lot of small pieces of land that are chopped up. And that's exactly what iqta' was. That each person would get a parcel of land and they would be able to derive rents from that land. Because one of the major issues that Shakhr and Tughril were dealing with is that they had this large group of nomadic people. Not all of them were from the Seljuk tribe. Some of them had just come because they noticed the Seljuks winning all of these victories. And what was the typical way that these nomadic tribes would derive wealth? Well, that would be pillaging, burning, and destruction, right? And then you confiscate the wealth from the area you pillaged, and that was your compensation. Now, if you're trying to run an empire, that becomes a massive problem, because now you've engendered a lot of negativity from the people that you've plundered. You've also destroyed your ability to grow economically, because you've destroyed the farms, the towns, the artisanry, the educated classes. You can't construct an empire this way. And so by creating these iqta', each of these Turkic tribes could take land, but they could not pillage it. The only way that they could achieve rents would be from taxing the local population, would be from selling the goods of the local population, and accordingly being able to generate wealth in a long-term stream, which would prevent the violence against the local population. So this was an incredibly intelligent strategy from the perspective of preventing large-scale destruction from these tribes. You can contrast this kind of Turkic invasion from the Mongol invasion that would come 2 centuries later, and was significantly more destructive, because the Mongols, at least in the first round of conquest, were not interested in parceling out the land, but retrieving money through conquest and booty. I have a question. The pale lilac parcels look widely dispersed. Wouldn't that have made it much harder to organize and rule? This map is not an accurate map of the size and shape of the Iqta. In fact, the Iqta were significantly smaller than the shape on this map, but I was doing it to give a perspective of how divided these territories would be, in that you would have a number of these parcels as opposed to a unified organizational entity with, for example, states or provinces. This was far more granular than that. And the Persian bureaucracy was the one that was in charge of ruling it. Now, after Tughral and Chagre died, they were succeeded by Chagre's son, Alparslan, who you can see on the right-hand side. And Alparslan and Nizam al-Mulk became very, very close. And Nizam al-Mulk was able to request from Alparslan more and more power in terms of the administration of this ever-growing Seljuk Empire, to which Alparslan agreed. And one of the things that Nizam al-Mulk requested almost immediately was the construction of universities. And these universities were called the Nizamiya. You can see a university on the right-hand side. This is not the Nizamiya of Baghdad, which was the first Nizamiya, but was another one in the system. So you can see this would have been the typical design. And when we say universities, we're talking about effective training for a Persian-style bureaucracy to operate within the entirety of the Seljuk territory. So the governance style, right, under the Umayyads, under the Abbasids, was different province by province. You didn't have the Persian bureaucrats operating in areas that had not been historically Persian. This is going to change with the Seljuks, who are creating this Persian-style bureaucracy that will be enforced over the Iqta throughout the Seljuk Empire. And of course, we have the Battle of Manzikert. And the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 completely changes the history of Anatolia. What ends up happening is that you have the emperor himself, Romanus IV of the Byzantine Empire, confronting the Seljuks on a field outside of the city of Malazgirt in modern-day Turkey, in the eastern part of Turkey, as you can see on the map on the right-hand side. Now, in terms of the way the Turks attacked, what they did was that they first engaged with the Romans, but then they used their light cavalry to quickly retreat. This was a common tactic among the Turks, that they would use what was called a feint, where they would engage the enemy and then pull back more quickly than the enemy could charge at them, because the enemy is primarily infantry. So this creates distance between the front line of the enemy and the back line of the enemy. Once the front line and back line are far enough apart, the Turks will then turn around and destroy the front line that no longer has that secondary defense behind it. And that's exactly what happened here. After the feint, Alparslan is able to directly attack first the left flank, then the center flank, then the center, and actually capture Romanus IV. To add insult to injury, the back was controlled by a man named Andronikos Doukas, who was a competing noble for the Byzantine throne. And so when he saw that Romanus IV was in trouble, he actually retreated in order to secure a better position for his family in terms of the Byzantine ruling hierarchy. So Romanus IV was captured by Alparslan. You can see it eulogized in this French painting from the Middle Ages. And there's a famous quote that Emperor Romanus IV was taken by Alparslan and asked by him, what would you do if our places had been exchanged and you had taken me? And the emperor said, I would kill you where you stand. And Alparslan says, I'll do you worse. I'll send you back. Right. And of course, Emperor Romanus IV is now humiliated from having been conquered, having been captured by Turks, and the entire eastern side of the Byzantine Empire, which had held firm against repeated Umayyad and Abbasid attempts to conquer, was now wide open. Yeah, I have a comment here. This retreat tactic was also called Kurkapana. Yeah, the wolf trap. The feint retreat is the general type of tactic. Kurkapana is what it's called in the Turkic context. Yeah. So then one of the things that I want to point out to you is how effective the Iqta system is in terms of expanding the empire. So if you look at these two maps, the map on the left is from 1072, the map on the right is from 1076. So that's 4 years. And you can see how quickly that purple area, the area controlled by the Seljuks, expanded in Anatolia, such that almost 2/3 or more of the territory was controlled by Turks. Now, understand, of course, that this is not controlled by a singular national federalized entity. This is controlled as thousands of iqta that are taken by each of these Turkic princes, snagging this piece of land, and the next one snags another piece of land, right? And they're trying to acquire the best pieces of land with the most peasants so they can generate more rents from that land. And so while the map below is from a different time period, and so the colors mean something completely different, you can sort of understand how jigsaw puzzle-like the Seljuk Empire was, even though externally it looks like this massive, incredible power that can bring so much to bear. So as we get to the time of the Crusades, the Seljuk Sultanate expands to its greatest amount of territory within the Anatolian Peninsula, and it gets almost to within shooting distance of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Given the speed by which this happened, right, this was just 10 years after the Battle of Manzikert, the Byzantine Empire is at serious risk of collapse and serious worry of collapsing. I have a couple more questions in the comments. From what regions were the European slaves coming from? As I addressed, most of them were coming from the Slavic regions, what's now Ukraine, Russia, Poland. There were some coming from Spain, but generally speaking, they were coming from coastal regions that were not controlled by Muslim majority powers. There was another question: is what years did the Vikings start to breach Constantinople? As far as I'm aware, the Vikings never breached Constantinople. If you're talking about the Varangian Guard were hired by Constantinople. If you're talking about the Fourth Crusade, that's 1204, but we'll discuss that in session 3. I have a question: how is this related to the arrival of ethnic Turkic peoples into Anatolia? This is it. This is the first major Turkic presence in Anatolia. There were Turks, of course, before as Mamluk, right? That were owned not by the Muslims, but by the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire had a number of different mercenarial groups, and some of these groups were Turkic Mamluk or Turkic tribes that were free and stayed in Turkey. And for example, there's the group, the Karamanlides, who are a Christian Turkic group that were deported in 1923 because of the land exchanges with Greece, population exchanges with Greece. But they were Christian Turks. And so there is a question about, for example, were those Turks that were brought in by the Byzantine Empire, they converted to Christianity and became a border force for them. So there were Turks in Anatolia before this invasion, but this invasion really is the beginning of that process. And were any Vikings involved in the Crusades? Not that I'm aware of in any serious substantive capacity. There were certainly people coming from Denmark, from Norway, from Sweden, among the European populations that joined into the Crusades, but none of them are specifically a Viking confederation or something similar to that. All right. And so this is sort of the European perspective, and I apologize that this map is in Hungarian. A lot of times, the best map that you can find is not in English, but you can see the Seljuk Dorylaeum, right? Which is the empire, right? You've got the Byzantine Dorylaeum in the west. That's the Byzantines. You've got the Fatimid Caliphatus, the Fatimid Caliphate. You have the Ghaznavidak, which are the Ghaznavids that I was referring to earlier. And so these Seljuks are now controlling almost all of the Middle East. There is that small little enclave in the southern part that's called Danishmend, which was another Turkic tribe. They just were a Turkic tribe that refused to align with the Great Seljuk. Once they had gotten their iqta, they basically declared independence. That's basically what happened there with the Danishmends. But from the European perspective, they now saw this incredibly large, powerful state, as opposed to this, which is probably closer to what it was. Again, this is from the year 1155, so the time period is a little off. And so those of you who can read Arabic will see that some of the things don't match, but it really gives a good sense of how divided the Seljuk territories were. You can see in red, those are regions called Arabeg, which are the most autonomous of those regions. You have regions in pink that are semi-autonomous. No, sorry, the regions in pink are the most autonomous. Then the Arabeg come after that, which are semi-autonomous. Then the areas in sort of grayish brown, those are the most loyal to the Great Seljuk. And so you have a number of these different regions jockeying for power, and you have that black solid line. Everything to the east of that black solid line is far more connected to the Great Seljuk than everything to the west of that line, which is increasingly more autonomous and more independent. So it's important for us to understand that the Seljuk Empire, despite being a unitary idea in concept, was in actuality a number of small iqta that were these feuding states that were constantly contesting each other for power and dominance within the wider Seljuk imperial system. I have a question of who are the Karakhidnak? Those are, it's a Central Asian tribe called the Karakhitai, or the Black Khitans. They existed during this period, but since they're not really involved in the Crusades, I wasn't going to touch on them that much. They were a massive force in terms of holding the trade routes between the Middle East and China, because their territory expanded as far east as what's now Tajikistan. All right, so go back a little bit. One of the other points that we should make clear is that by 1092, the Seljuks in Anatolia were beginning to break off from the control of the Great Seljuk in Isfahan in Iran. And so you can see that there's a slightly different color for the Seljuk Sultan of Rum. Now, this is sort of a confusing title, and I'll sort of get into it a little bit later. But what's important to recognize here is that the sultans in what's now Turkey and the sultans in what's the wider greater Seljuk Sultanate are not seeing eye to eye at all. They have basically done everything short of declaring independence. And again, I sort of wanted to really hammer home this point of granularity. This is the year 1090. These are specific Arab tribes that also have iqta in what's now Lebanon and Syria. And you can see just how small we're talking about. We're talking about city-states here. I have a question of, this is fascinating. I can't believe that I never studied this. Can you recommend a book or an online course where I can learn more? Of course, you can attend my course. I have the Middle Eastern Islamic History series. I'll put a link to that in the meetup for this. But if you want an actual scholarly article that goes into this kind of detail, sorry. If you want an actual scholarly article that goes into this kind of detail, a lot of these scholarly articles focus on one of these periods. I'm giving you sort of an overview of what's going on that you won't really find in a singular text. So I don't know what to recommend. If you want to learn more about the Seljuks, there are numerous books written. I would search for anything about Alparslan, about Melik Shah I. Those will because Melik Shah I is the guy who succeeds Alparslan. If you want sources about that, then those are the two people to really look into, because that really explains the Seljuk Empire and its growth as well as its fragmented nature. I have a question. Was the climate terrain in the region similar to what it is now? Yes and no. Because you mentioned that Iraq changed significantly. Iraq changed significantly from the ancient period. By this point, it was still fertile, but it wasn't anywhere near as fertile as it was in the ancient period. And so our current understandings about what fertility was in this region are generally correct for that time. It was semi-arid, but Anatolia is not semi-arid. Anatolia has forests. Anatolia has green areas. Anatolia grows food very easily. Ask somebody from the interior of Turkey. It's not, it is somewhat dry. It's certainly not as lush as, say, the east coast of the United States, but it is definitely an area that is green enough. So I wanted to sort of give sort of a lens into what was going on in the Great Seljuk Empire. So as I mentioned, there was Melik Shah, and Melik Shah died in 1094, and he was succeeded by a man named Bakuyaruk. But Bakuyaruk, as you can see, only controls the area in orange directly. And there were other great Seljuks who contested his power. For example, there was Sultan Muhammad I Topar, who was ruling from 1105 to 1118 as the Great Seljuk, but before that, he was actually in a civil war with Bakuyaruk, completely within the Seljuk Empire, right? They were having this fight. You also have a number of groups like the Artukads, and I'm just going to focus on the Artukads because we have much better attested records for them than a lot of these other Aqta. But if you sort of cookie cutter multiply what I'm going to talk about, you sort of have a sense of how fractious this situation was. So the Artukads controlled the area between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers in the northern part of Iraq. And for those who are not familiar with how that area is, there are a lot of small rivers like the Great Zab River that flow through this area. And because you have all these minor rivers and tributaries coming from the Anatolian highlands, this area is actually very capable of growing grass and small amounts of crops. Now, the grass is absolutely perfect for the Turks because they have large numbers of horses and they need to feed them. So this area called the Jazira, or island, because it's surrounded by all these different river systems, becomes hotly contested. And the Artukads managed to get their control over this area. They then launch a war against a number of the confederations along the Levant, pushing as far south as Jerusalem, right? So they're conquering all this area, then they get pushed back into the Jazira, and we have these sort of horse archers moving around. They have incredible mobility because of this, because of their light cavalry structure, and you can see emirs fighting each other, killing each other, pulling back, and the land is just divided between these fighting emirs. All right, so we now move to the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum and sort of discussing what that is. So as we mentioned, there was a division increasingly between the Seljuks who controlled the Anatolian Peninsula and those Seljuks who controlled the rest of the empire, including those various Iqta fighting factions. Within Rum, many of these Iqta had united behind a number of very capable generals from the same family as the Seljuks who ruled to the east. And those came behind the power of Kilich Arslan, who you can see on the left-hand side. And they called themselves the Sultanate of Rum, specifically because Rum was their word for Rome, right? They considered themselves to have conquered the Roman Empire. And that's not such a far-fetched assumption for them to have made, specifically because the term Byzantine Empire that we use for the Eastern Roman Empire was not a term that the Byzantines used themselves. The Byzantines called themselves the Roman Empire. So when the Turks conquered them, they considered themselves the Roman emperors now, which is a sort of a funny image for us. looking at it from the modern day and our associations with what Rome represents, but from their perspective, they were the Seljuk sultans of Rome, and their pronunciation of Rome was Rum. I have a question of where did they keep the women if they were so mobile? The women came with them. The women weren't fighting in most cases. There were some cases where women fought, but the women came with them. They lived in mobile living quarters called gers or yurts. When they finally settled down, they began to build housing, but the women traveled with the men. One of the interesting things is that because of the association of the indigenous people of Anatolia with this title of being Roman, the the Greek Orthodox Church, which is based in Anatolia, Constantinople, Greece, all these areas, become called as Rum as well, because they are the Romans. And we have the clear development within the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome, and this technology spreads to other areas of the Sipahi, or light cavalry. Somebody asked if I can recommend ACS Peacock's The Great Seljuk Empire. I don't know how good that is or not. I see no reason to think that it would be a bad source. So like a lot of cases, it's more about getting the fundamental understanding of the time period, because this is an incredibly chaotic time period in terms of finding clear and definitive sources, because borders are changing all the time within the Greater Seljuk Empire. So now that we covered the introduction and we spent an hour sort of covering all of our bases, we can now finally talk about what we actually came here to talk about, which is fantastic. I have a question here. Where did the word sultan comes from? It comes from the Arabic word salat. Salat means power or control. So sultan is the person with power or control. And the word was used because they wanted a lot of rulers wanted to differentiate themselves from the caliph, right? The caliph has religious authority, and the sultan didn't have the genetic credentials. I didn't go into it here, but there are genetic and ancestral credentials that somebody needs to have to be a caliph until the 16th century. And even after that point, it's still contentious. And those genetic credentials meant that a number of these terrestrial rulers could not claim to be caliph. That said, a lot of them did wield terrestrial power. So they took this term sultan, meaning that they were the one in power. And of course, the Turks, not having the genetic credentials, were always identified as sultans. So if we look at the Crusades, we have a very interesting timeline, right? Between the First and Second Crusade, we have a long period of time. Between the Second and Third Crusade, we have a long period of time. And then the Crusades become closer and closer paced together. And what's important to note is who is in control of Jerusalem, to give you a sort of sense of how effective the Crusaders are. After the First Crusade, Jerusalem belongs to the Christians, who hold it until a little bit before the Third Crusade. In fact, the Third Crusade is launched in order to recapture Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem falls in that period to Saladin and his successors. Those successors end up giving Jerusalem back to the Crusaders as a gift. We'll explain that when we get to the Fifth and Sixth Crusade. I believe that's the final session. And then the Christians lose it to the Khwarezmian tribes, who give it back to Saladin's successors, and later the Mongols. Sorry, later the Mamluks from Egypt, who overthrow Saladin's successors, the Ayyubids. Now, you can see also in the timeline that the Crusader states, there are four of them, but Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, which eventually is reduced to the city of Acre, that's why it's represented that way, exist for an incredibly long amount of time. The Crusader state of Edessa, which is the first to form, is also the first to go away. But it's not just that there are crusades in the Middle East. There are also crusades in Europe as well, right? The Iberian Reconquest is a crusade with the same dispensation as the Crusades in the Middle East. You have what are called the Baltic or Northern Crusades, which are against the pagan people who are living in what is now Lithuania, Latvia, and the areas of Russia that are nearby, Belarus and Russia that are nearby to Latvia and Lithuania. And the pagans wouldn't be removed from these areas until the mid-1300s. And of course, you have the Albigensian Crusade, which is against a Christian group in the south of France called the Cathars, who rejected the teachings of the Catholic Church and were butchered to death by Catholics for their apostasy. Now, those so those two crusades, those three crusades, the Iberian Crusade, the Northern Crusade, and the Albigensian Crusade, are not ones that I plan to touch on. So I was going to focus primarily on the Middle Eastern Crusades, and there's more than enough to cover in terms of the Middle East to deal with. If at the end of this we decide that might be interesting, we might devote another session to that. But there is a lot to cover in those crusades as well. They're very complicated wars. So we also have to understand the Fatimid relationship with the Europeans and what they were fearing from these Seljuks and the Fatimids. So the first one is that the Fatimids under Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah, who ruled around the year 1000, ordered to destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the early 1000s. And he was successful in this. He destroyed a number of churches as well. He was there are not many Muslim rulers who destroy Christian religious patrimony, but he was one of them. In fact, his successors worked with the Byzantines to rebuild the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the version we have today, is more or less the construction by the Fatimids and Byzantines working together after al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah died and he was succeeded. But the possibility that a Muslim ruler could destroy Christian holy sites in the Holy Land was always a recurrent thought in Europe. Combine that with the fact that the Seljuks were beginning to cut off migration to the Holy Land, both from a religious perspective, or at least their understanding of religion, and from a functional perspective with all of these invasions and constant wars within the Seljuk Sultanate going on, that there was an immense fear within Europe that these sites might be destroyed and never be accessible again. You also have to realize that there were a number of different celestial events going on at the same time. There were droughts, meteorites, comets, eclipses, all around the 1100 year. And finally, with the Seljuk Turks so close to Constantinople, you began to have what were called Akinji. Akinji are even lighter cavalry than the Sipahis, so extremely lightly armed. And their goal was to go into a town, plunder it, and get out before the alarm could be raised. And so you had these Akinji raids going on throughout the Byzantine Empire. And so there was a fear that these Turks would come almost as a boogeyman to Europe and destroy it. I have a question, who are considered pagan and by whom? Was infidel the same as pagan, or was that a term used for not of the Islamic faith? When I said that the northern people were pagans, the ones in Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, some parts of Russia that I joined there were pagan, I mean that in the sense of being polytheistic. There's not a name for that faith as far as I'm aware that was practiced, especially in Lithuania, but it was a faith that worshiped the rivers and the trees and other local spirits, believed in mythological creatures like satyrs. So it is a pagan under the Christian understanding as well. The Muslims would not use the word pagan to refer to Christians. They would use the word people of the book, right? Jews and Christians are people of the book. To the extent that there were Christians that they considered outside of acceptability, they would call them kuffar, right? Disbelievers, unbelievers. All right. So now we have to look for a second towards Europe and see, in addition to these sorts of fears about what could happen to the Holy Land, what was going on in Europe that would lead to the Crusades happening at this time from a European perspective, right? The first thing is that Europe is not a united polity either. And while it doesn't have the uniform governance style of the Seljuk Sultanate, where it has this sort of Persian bureaucracy, regardless of the various sects, you have a number of feuding and rival states with a number of knights, and Europeans are going to war with each other on a constant basis. But it's not just that, right? The model of revenue generation among European knights is not dissimilar from the model of revenue generation among wild Turkic hordes, which is that you attack a civilian area, plunder it, destroy it, and take the money. Because, of course, the knight himself isn't benefiting, at least personally, from the large-scale infrastructure of the cities and towns. Conversely, church clerics absolutely need wealthy communities to donate tithe. So the interests against having these knights and these brigands operating in Europe was very strong, and a way to get them out was very helpful. Another piece was that just war theory had a long history in Christianity at this point. And just war theory is the idea that there are certain occasions under which war is acceptable or permissible. And one of those situations is when the holy places of Christianity are under threat, and there is no viable diplomatic way to achieve that. And negotiating with the Turks, given all the Akıncı raids, was seen as incredibly difficult, if not impossible. I have a question about whether the questions can be after the lecture. I prefer not, because then it doesn't, yeah, there's a lot of things that end up being covered because people ask questions, so I prefer it that way. Now, you also had the church being able to grant salvation, which was incredibly useful to people on an individual level, and the church could incentivize the Crusades through the possibility of gaining a road to paradise. But it wasn't just paradise that was being offered. You were also offering physical benefits, because in many cases, unless you were the first son of a landed lord, you were not going to inherit land, because of the laws of primogeniture, that the firstborn son would inherit and the other sons would not. So if you were a lord, if you were the second son of a lord or a third son of a lord, the only way you'd be able to get land is if you conquered it. So the offer of going to the Middle East and conquering that land and making your own territory was incredibly appealing to these kinds of people. And for a lot of poorer individuals, the possibility of doing anything outside of the regimented life that they had come to expect was something highly desirable. So when Alexios I Komnenos, emperor of the Byzantine Empire, requested aid from Pope Urban II, he decided at the Council of Clermont to declare a crusade. That a holy war would be brought forth, that those who would serve in it would be cleansed of their sins for having served in it, and the goal was to reclaim Jerusalem. So people got very excited about the prospect of going and conquering Jerusalem, so much so that you had the first movement, which was the People's Crusade. And the People's Crusade was led by Peter the Hermit. You can sort of see him in the picture on the right-hand side. He gathered followers primarily in the Rhineland in Germany. And his followers were a generally poorer rabble. And at first, their argument was, why are we going to the Middle East to kill infidels? There are infidels right here, referring to the Jewish communities all up and down the Rhineland. And so you had a number of massacres. You can see the massacre of Metz on the left-hand side, towards the bottom. There was also a massacre in Mainz and in a number of other cities where the Jews were directly attacked. Emicho of Leiningen was the one who led the massacre at Mainz. And the Jewish communities were both stolen from and physically murdered in numerous pogroms that stretched across the Rhineland. But eventually the People's Crusade meandered their way through different countries. Now, given that the People's Crusade was not well organized, they quickly ran out of food by the time they got to the country of Hungary. And so they ended up pillaging and burning a number of Christian towns on their way to the border with the Seljuks. I have a question about where do the Hebrews and Israelites fit in? They're, by and large, there are more Jews in the Rhineland in Germany than there are in the Holy Land, but where Jews are relevant, we'll discuss them. And yeah, okay. So when they finally got to the border of Seljuk territory, they needed passage across the Bosphorus by the Byzantine emperor. And he was so ready to get rid of them that he sent them right across, and they went to a small area called Civitot in French, on the Seljuk side of the border. And the Seljuks at first looked at this completely bemusedly because they had no idea who these people were or what they were doing. But as soon as they started marching through Seljuk territory without permission, they just attacked them. And the Sipahi cut them down. This is a French imagining of how it happened. As you can, a Western European imagining of how it happened. And of course, the People's Crusaders are dressed in white for purity's sake. And the Turks are dressed as European knights would have been dressed, not as the Sipahis would have been dressed. And we've seen pictures of Sipahis in Ottoman before. That's how they would have struck them. But it gives you sort of a sense of what happened to the People's Crusade, that they just went and then they were destroyed. There's a question of, do you know why the Jews were persecuted in those times? Yeah, the persecution of the Jews is a very complex thing, but it boils down to religious reasons, right? Jews were the killers of Christ, at least in Christian perception at the time. There was wealth. Jews tended to be moneylenders and therefore had a stronger, and also tax collectors. And so they happened to have a large amount of money proportional to their population. And so it was often easier to attack them than to try than for many poor people to try their hand at business. There were political reasons. Usually there was fear of the unknown. If there was a virus or a plague, the Jews were considered guilty. There are a lot of different reasons that Jews were persecuted during this period. Somebody's asking why I call it the Seljuk route. Yes, the Seljuks were routing the People's Crusade. It's just how you read it. All right, so I guess I did add a map for the pagans. So if we delve a little deeper into Jewish persecution, you can see the number of cities, especially in the Rhineland, but also Prague and Bohemia, where Jews were persecuted during the Crusades. And you also had a number of Jews who were burned alive. You have cases where entire synagogues were burnt down with the congregations locked inside. You have situations where Jews tried to buy their lives by freely giving to the mob and mass haranguing them silver and gold and other things in order to offset them. If we're talking about the Northern Crusades, you can see the Germanic states, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Saxony, and they went into Livonia, which is modern-day Latvia and Estonia, as well as Lithuania, to attack the pagans, and also further into Norway and Sweden to Christianize the Vikings. Now, you also have to understand what the Middle Eastern perception of Europeans was. The Middle Easterners did not have a lot of exposure to Europeans. We have documents, for example, Al-Idrisi says that, that Europeans are blue, and the reason that Europeans are blue is because it's so cold there. They're always freezing all the time. So, so their skin changes colors. Because from the Arab perception, Europeans, especially from the north, were pale, and so that paleness came out in the color of their blood vessels, which was blue, right? Now there was a relationship between the Abbasid Caliphate and with Charlemagne's kingdom, and so you can see in the left-hand side a painting of Harun al-Rashid, the Abbasid Caliph, receiving messengers from Charlemagne, and the two of them exchanged gifts. And so the Middle Eastern perception of Europe was that it was this large country, which they called Frangistan, right? The land of the Franks, Frangistan. And it covered all of what's now France and Germany and most of northern Italy. To the extent that they had exposure to whites per se, was most commonly in the case of the Varangian Guard, which was a Slavic group of people, Slavic / Viking, ethnically speaking, group of people hired by the Byzantines as mercenaries in many of their fights in the Middle East, specifically because the Varangians were tall and were very distinctive looking. And so they were part of the Middle Eastern cultural memory. But beyond this, they had no understanding of European internecine fights. They were unfamiliar, for example, with the Schism of 1054 that split the Orthodox Church from the Catholic Church. They, at a very large scale, they had no idea of the various countries, ideologies that existed in Europe and the feudal system. Somebody asked, is the People's Crusade considered the First Crusade? No. We're going to get to the First Crusade. And it seems increasingly like the First Crusade will take place next week. But we finally have gotten to the beginning of the First Crusade, which is the siege of Nicaea, or the siege of Iznik, as the town is known in modern Turkish. So what distinguishes the First Crusade from the People's Crusade is that it is no longer being led by the people who have just come together, like Peter the Hermit. These are organized by knights, and so they have a sense of strategy and organization to them. These are primarily French knights, but there are knights of other places. So you can see Godfrey of Bouillon. He's the one with his arms outstretched in the leftmost picture, and he made an agreement with the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople. He considered that the Knights' Crusade had a much better chance of succeeding than did the People's Crusade. And so Alexios Komnenos, the Byzantine Emperor, made Godfrey of Bouillon and a number of the other Crusaders swear that they would return all of the territories that they conquered to the Byzantine Empire. These were Byzantine sovereign territories. So, and in many cases, Alexios Komnenos was very wary of giving these kinds of crusaders the ability to conquer land and then repatriate it to him, because some of them had gone to war with him in the past. For example, Bohemond of Taranto, we're going to talk about him more in subsequent slides, was a historic enemy of the Byzantine Empire and had fought with the Byzantines over their possessions on the Adriatic coast of what's now Greece, Albania, and Croatia. So to trust these people was seen as very difficult, but in exchange for agreeing to repatriate all lands to the Byzantine Empire, Godfrey of Bouillon and the other Crusader knights were given access to food as well as transportation across the Bosporus so they could arrive at Nicaea with their military encampments. Now, Somebody's asking if the poet Rumi is named for Rumi here. No. Yeah. All right. So you had the siege of Nicaea, and the knights were able to assemble catapults and trebuchets and other methods of attack of the city. And they were about to take the city in siege when the city itself surrendered to Alexios Komnenos, who had secretly been engaging in negotiations. And this further poisoned the relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the knights, because the knights considered Nicaea to have been their victory. They were the ones who forced the city into a point of capitulation, and Alexios had scooped the victory out from under them. So I have a question of which crusade was Jacques de Molay involved in? I think that was the Third Crusade, but don't hold me to that. So the First Crusade was sponsored by the Byzantine Church rather than the Roman Church. Sponsored in the sense of they were given food and passage, but there was no sponsorship in terms of being paid money. Neither did the Catholic Church pay money. Every crusader was responsible for his own self-financing. So we then move from Nicaea to Dorylaeum. And in Dorylaeum, we have a separation, a slight separation between Bohemond of Toronto and several of the other crusaders, especially led by Godfrey of Bouillon. And because the crusaders separated their forces, the Sipahi and Akinji decided to besiege Bohemond of Toronto, seeing that his force was smaller. And you can sort of imagine what that looks like from both the picture on the left-hand side and the picture on the right-hand side. Bohemond was completely surrounded by the Turks. But one of the things that's worth pointing out is that the armor that the knights wore, this chainmail armor, was pretty much impervious to Turkish arrows. So it meant that without a direct melee, they couldn't be defeated. And so you had this sort of slow whittling away of Bohemond's forces, and it was slow enough that the Crusaders, led by Godfrey of Bouillon, was able to attack the Turks from outside of their perimeter and win a decisive victory at Dorylaeum against the Seljuk Sultanate. Now, after the Battle of Dorylaeum, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum basically decides to ignore the Crusaders who are marching towards the Middle East. They see it as not their fight, especially since the Crusaders make it clear that they're trying to make their way to Armenian Cilicia, and then from Armenian Cilicia to go to the Great Seljuk Empire, which is on the eastern side. So they allow them safe passage as long as the Crusaders do not plunder or take from any of the territory that they pass through, which they generally oblige. There's a question of, could you give us a sense of the numbers of soldiers and non-combatants? We're talking maybe 10,000, 20,000 on each side. Did all the Crusaders go through Constantinople and ferry across the Bosphorus? No, some of them came by water. Some of them came over land. Some of them, the geopolitical situation is going to be different in every crusade. So a lot of them did come through Constantinople. Some of them bypassed Constantinople. It's entirely distinct. So I wanted to sort of set a map so we understand what we're talking about when we're talking about the Middle Eastern locations that we're going to mention. So you have the city of Antioch, which is in the southern part of Turkey. It's part of what's called Hatay province of Turkey. And in Turkish, it's called Antakya today. So that's the city of Antioch. It's very close to the coast, and it was a historically very strong Christian city, one of the 5 major sees of the Pentarchy. You then have the city of Edessa, which is also in Turkey, further inland. The Turks today call it Şanlıurfa. You have the city of Aleppo, which the Arabs call Halab. You have Mosul in northern Iraq. You have Tripoli on the Lebanese coast. You have Damascus, right, which is much further south within Syria, but roughly as far from the coast as Aleppo is. You have Ascalon, which is what the Crusaders and the Arabs called that city, which is now the modern Israeli city of Ashkelon. You have the city of Jerusalem, which in Hebrew is called Yerushalayim, and in Arabic is called Al-Quds. And in Egypt, we won't talk about most of these cities today, but you have the city of Damietta on the Egyptian coast. You have Bilbais, which is a large Christian city at towards the mouth the base of the Nile Delta, and you have Cairo or Al-Qahira, which is at the base of the Nile Delta, and was the Fatimid capital city. So when we talk about the Crusaders coming from Armenian Cilicia, we're talking about them coming from the Turkish coast at the northwestern side of this picture and rounding the coast, following the water of the Mediterranean towards Antioch. And that is their general direction. I have a question. Did the Crusaders have money? How were they buying food, water, clothes on their journey? They had what they brought with them. In terms of financing, you have letters of credit that start being developed in the middle of the First Crusade, where money in a bank in Venice is represented by money held by the knights who are marching ahead of them. And so a person, when the knights would be resupplied, the wealth that they had in Venice would be shifted to them. And so that way they would have money in their assets, even if they didn't have it on their person. Okay. So if we're looking at the path, this sort of goes to one of the earlier questions. You can sort of see that in the First Crusade, nearly everybody went through Constantinople and to get to Edessa or Jerusalem. We're going to talk about why there's that split later. But for example, the Genoese, who were sending reinforcements, came over sea and completely bypassed Constantinople. Somebody asked, all these wars are about who get to rule land areas. I think it's a little more complicated than that, but that is certainly part of it. And as you can see, if you follow the arrow down Asia Minor, right after the Battle of Dorylaeum, they made their way to Cilicia. From Cilicia, they went to Antioch. Except that Baldwin Baldwin of Boulogne, who was one of the four leading Crusader knights, there were many Crusader knights, but he was one of the four leading ones, decided that he was going to make a different turn. He wasn't going to go south to Antioch, he was going to go east to Edessa. And when he got to Edessa, he found a very interesting situation. This was a territory that had been reclaimed by the Byzantines a short while earlier from the Turks, and the person in charge of ruling it was an Armenian, Toros, but Toros of Edessa had converted to Orthodox Christianity in order to be accepted by the Byzantine Empire. The Armenian Apostolic Church was a different church from the Orthodox Church of Constantinople, which is of course a different church from the Catholics, right? So you have three different churches going on here. Now, the Armenians welcomed Baldwin of Boulogne because they saw him as a possibility to regain authority within the city. They figured that under a Catholic rulership that was dependent on the Armenians as opposed to the Byzantines, that they would be able to have increased power. And that was indeed the case. So when Baldwin came, you can see the Armenian clergy graciously accepting him into the city. And then the Armenians all gathered Toros and shot him with arrows in the citadel, as you can see memorialized by the picture above. When Baldwin came into the city, he accepted the crown of the county of Edessa, which made this the first Crusader-controlled territory in the but in what was formerly Seljuk territory or formerly Byzantine territory. And because the Byzantines hadn't been able to assist the Crusaders further, in many ways, the Crusaders saw the Byzantines as no longer holding up their part of the bargain in terms of that the land should return to them, because the Byzantines were not providing the food and support that they had promised. And so this becomes the foundation of the Crusader state of Edessa. There's a question of how many days did it take to travel from Constantinople to Antioch by foot? We're talking about a month about that. And from Genoa to Antioch by ship, probably about 3 weeks. But Constantinople to Antioch is a much shorter distance than Genoa to Antioch. Yeah. Did the Crusaders loot Constantinople? Not in this crusade. That's the Fourth Crusade. Okay. So I guess this is a good place to stop. Edessa has just been liberated, and now we have the Battle of Antioch, as the remaining Crusaders, other than Baldwin, are now going to besiege the city of Antioch, and we can cover this next week. Any additional questions?
At the same time.
Same time. And I regret showing up late. Next week we will start at 2 o'clock.
Oh no, Richard, that's no problem at all. We just appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to spend some time with us, educate us on this complex topic, which in a lot of the comments, people are typing, gee, this is something I don't really know much about, but I'm happy to finally learn about it. So we appreciate that. So yeah, we'll meet the same time. So for the different sessions that Richard's going to be hosting, they're all going to have different Zoom numbers. So you'll need to register for them independently. I'll send out the invites. The future ones like number 3 and number 4 aren't on our calendar just yet, but we'll put those out there in the near future. Let's see, this program is being recorded. So if you want to listen to it again, or you missed the first part, or you know anyone else that'd be interested, it'll be on our YouTube channel. I can send out the link for that a little bit later. And then I wanted to mention there was a film that Richard recommended, kind of sort of about the Crusades, a Hollywood film, Kingdom of Heaven, starring Orlando Bloom. Not sure if any of you seen that one before. I was going to see if I could actually get it and live stream it for our group. We'll probably do it after Richard finishes his program, though.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably really helpful for understanding the Third Crusade, and can give you sort of a lay of the land of the players in terms of sort of organization and development, even as early as the First Crusade, because the relationships between the knights you can sort of see there as well.
Okay. We probably won't be able to set that up before the next 2 weeks. So maybe what we'll do is we'll try and maybe do that after Richard finishes his program, and then we can go watch that.
Robert, if I could say 2 things.
Yeah, sure.
First, because I see it in the comments, I will put a link to my other presentations in the meetup page for this meetup, so you can see those if you're interested. As I said, this is a part of my Middle Eastern history series. I've sort of
so can you talk about that? Why don't you elaborate about that? Like, tell people what exactly you're doing for those not familiar with it.
Every Tuesday night, we might have to shift the night because things are changing in my world. It'll probably shift to Thursday night, but every Tuesday night, pretty much since last July, I've been putting out 2 hours a discussion of how the Middle East has changed since Muhammad, right? Going through the development of all the different caliphates. The stuff that I did in the introduction that took us about an hour is actually about 20 hours worth of content that I've tried to pick the most salient and important points from. But if you want to see the whole piece, the gradual change and development of the Middle East, that's that series. And the 27th in the series, which will cover the Russo-Turkish Wars, is this Tuesday night at 7 p.m. And I'll put the link to that is also on the New York and Washington D.C. Sorry, it's in the New York group. But I'll put a link to that in both, so you can register for that if you're interested.
And if someone doesn't see the link, don't worry, I'll email that to you as well.
Yeah. And a second thing is, I wouldn't be where I am today without Robert and Zach. So I really want to thank them for giving me the time to put this out there and to work with them. To that end, if you are interested in what I'm doing and you really like the presentations that I'm giving, please consider a donation to Zach's history group. It helps him maintain all the Zoom costs and everything to put this together.
Richard, we really appreciate you, because when I give topics on history, they're kind of more pop culture, modern focus. So really appreciate you and Zach coming on board and joining up with us to share knowledge on this topic, which again was really interesting. The number of people that were, I'm kind of paraphrasing much different comments, are like, wow, this is a topic that I don't really know much about, and really excited to have a chance to learn more about it. So our thanks goes to you as well.
Yeah, I'm so thankful that so many people are excited. Now, there seem to be several questions in the Q&A, so let's take a quick look.
Someone asked earlier, how did you get initially interested in this topic?
Well, I mean, that's my history, right? My family is Iraqi. We were kicked out of the country because we were Jewish. There was a lot of anti-Semitism both during World War II in Iraq because of the Nazi influence. The Nazis never conquered Iraq, but Iraq became a Nazi ally in 1941. For a few weeks before the British overturned the government. But the sentiment was still strong because of the Nazi connection to Arab nationalism. And I just an abridge on that. But because of those things, my family ended up here in the States. But I always grew up around this Arabic language. I grew up around understanding this kind of culture and these kinds of behaviors. And I discovered that when I was speaking to many Americans, especially in the wake of September 11th, that they really didn't understand my part of the world. And they didn't understand it because it's either not being represented right on the media, which is fine, or the experts who are being asked to talk about it are being asked to talk about it in 5-minute stints. And as you could see from when I was discussing things here, 5 minutes barely covers anything. And so even if they could say everything that I could say, or they could say even more than I can say, they can't say it in the time frame that really manages to put these things together. And because of my command of English and my command of the Middle Eastern languages that I have, I can access this information in a way and transmit it in a way that I feel that a lot of people can't. So that really got me interested in how can I bring my world to life. And so that's what I do here.
Okay, no, that's awesome. Thank you. Appreciate that. Let me go back to the questions.
I'm going to put a link to Zach's donation account in the meetup page as well. So yeah.
Let's see. Oh, so if we were talking about the film, it was Kingdom of Heaven is the film with Orlando Bloom about the Crusades. And then Catherine chimed in. Thanks, Catherine. She said, watch the director's cut if possible. It's more accurate. So appreciate that, Catherine. That's one thing that's really neat about this group and these programs. There's so many smart people that come here and share their knowledge, not just the speakers. They always end up learning a lot from the audience as well. So thank you very much.
Somebody asked, what's the link up page? No, the meetup page, like how you found on Meetup to come here. I'll put a comment or a couple comments with all the links that you need in order to find me, to find the donations, to find the other episodes in this series. If you're willing to tolerate me, I'm more than happy to oblige you.
And if you don't see the link, don't worry, we'll email it to you.
Somebody asked, can you speak to the continued history of the region and how it informs your view of how history should be represented? That's a difficult question. The thing is that the assumption in the West is that time is progressive, that in each generation, people know what came before and will do something different than what their ancestors did, and that this is the natural rate of change, right? We shouldn't have a situation anymore in the United States where Jim Crow becomes the national law, or something like Jim Crow becomes a national law in the United States. We did that, we're done with that, we're moving forward. The Middle East doesn't operate on that paradigm. There are certainly progressive people in the Middle East, and we should definitely talk about them and their political aspirations and support them. But the Middle East is not operating on that paradigm. The Middle East is operating on the paradigm of multiple different individual factions, and those factions politically, socially, economically are all pursuing different goals. Some of them may be a view of the past that they want to resurrect. Some of them might be a view of the future that they want to create. Some of them might be an instantiation of the current situation. Some of them might be a completely different style of government, but not conservative or progressive in terms of their policy. So you have these different groups that are vying for power, and you have to understand that it's something closer to a Game of Thrones setup than it is to this progressive, one-directional history, this teleological history. The Middle East doesn't have that. There's no uniform vision that if you brought 100 Middle Easterners, that 30 of them would agree on. Never mind all 100 of them, right? If you brought together 100 Americans, you'd have 50 of them with vision Y and 50 of them with vision X. And that's primarily how we've cordoned ourselves into two political parties, or maybe 40-40, and then 20 who are somehow independent-minded. But that's the way the Middle East should be represented. It should be represented as this multiplicity of voices and what it is that each one of them wants and why. If I could narrow this down to a specific modern situation, we had the election for the government of Egypt in 2012, which was the first free and open election and the only open election in the history of the Egyptian Republic. And you had a number of different political parties that were running in that election. You had progressive candidates that were trying to implement something closer to a Western standard of democracy. You had Nasserists who were interested in implementing something that's closer to Arab nationalism and Arab socialism. You had Islamists who were trying to create a sort of proto-Islamic state based on a modern application of Islamic law from the 7th century. You have states that you have leaders who are trying to create a military dictatorship, like running in an election to create a military dictatorship. You have people who were trying to create a new type of unified state with the other Arab states, a pan-Arab movement. You had other people who were running on being Egypt for Egyptians. So now that ended up winnowing down to the final vote between two candidates, one being the military candidate and the other one being the Islamist candidate, meaning the theological candidate, the one who wanted to create a theocracy. But in the first round, there were 15 different people running for the presidency of Egypt, and all of them actually had a shot. They didn't have a great shot, but they all had a shot. And that should sort of tell you where the Arab world is, in that we don't have a goal that everybody or even a significant minority are aspiring to. We're all going in different directions, and that's the confusion that Westerners should see, that it's not just this great Islamic horde like bearing down on you. There's a lot of different players involved. I hope that answers the question.
Oh yeah, no, I think it does. That was actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to ask you what you would think, like maybe the biggest misconception is about the Crusades, and just for myself, not knowing
about the Crusades, it's actually very different. I would say the biggest misconception about the Crusades is that it was some European imperialist venture to conquer the Middle East and bring it into Europe. That's not what this was. The concept of European imperialism doesn't exist yet. If anything, the analog of the Crusades is the Viking raids on Northern Europe. This is the Viking raids on the Middle East. The Crusades are a bunch of poor Europeans who stumble into a much more developed but worse organized society. And therefore, they sort of find themselves in a very awkward situation of being militarily ascendant, but not culturally ascendant. And that's the Crusades. And these are there are a number of stories that I'll talk about in next week, where Crusaders and indigenous people, both Christians, Muslims, Jews, because there are indigenous people of all three, right? And the Latins, being the Crusaders and their descendants, are interacting. And it's just funny because there's so many cultural faux pas and so many cultural issues that they have of trying to blend in, and everybody's sort of trying to avoid antagonizing everybody else, because there's just so much difference between how people perceive things. And then by the time of the Second Crusade, when the Second Crusaders come and they see the Latins who have been living in the area for now, 40 years, they don't understand those people, because those people have become semi-assimilated and acculturated. And they're like, why are you talking to these infidels? Like, there are Muslims and Jews here. Like, why are you talking to them? And the Latins were trying to explain to the new Crusaders, these are the people who live here. Like, this is how the system works. Like, you can't just go around slaughtering people. So it's sort of this weird situation where not everybody is on the same page. It's not like when the US invaded Iraq, which of course Bush called a crusade in his utter stupidity. That's not what the Crusades were. The European imperialist ventures of the 19th century and the American ventures in the Middle East are something entirely different from what the Crusades were. And it's really misguided to connect the two.
My number one takeaway from all this is someone who didn't know a lot about this topic, just boy, how complex this history is. It's just, you kind of maybe oversimplified version. There's a few different crusades and the people go down there and try and take care of stuff. And boy, it's just really complex with all these different people and groups and events and different goals and things happening and stuff. So that was kind of my main takeaway. Like, wow, this is a really complex history that, of course, you did a great job of kind of outlining the details on. So appreciate that. Let's see if there was anything else that popped up.
Yeah, there are a lot of thank yous. I really appreciate all of the kind words. I have a question, but isn't it that anything that's chaotic also spreads fear and terror? It depends how the chaos is manifested, right? When we talk about the dysfunction within the Great Seljuk Sultanate, or we talk about all these different states trying to organize, for most peasants on a day-to-day basis, like, it wasn't that chaotic. It was chaotic when the large-scale revolution came blundering through your town, but that was it. Otherwise, most people just lived their lives, and they lived as landed peasants, or they were slaves, or they were whatever. Like, the ruling people are a very small percentage of any society. So for most people, the chaos was just sort of normal. The idea that we have today of states where we have a government that is effective in policing the majority of the population, that is a 19th century development. That, like, at this period in time, you were thanking your lucky stars every day that a rampaging horde of whatever didn't come through. So I think that covers it. The question, will this be available on YouTube? Yes, it will be. The link will be placed on this meetup. It will be available on YouTube probably in a couple days. Depends how long it takes for it to save. All right.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Richard. Greatly appreciate that. Again, we'll post a recording. It might not get posted tomorrow, though.
Yeah,
we'll email that out and post it in the link. And we'll see everyone the same time next week, 2 p.m. for round 2.
Round 2. All right. See you guys.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Richard. Appreciate it. Bravo. Great job.
All right. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.